Hi, this is Eric. Today we're going to look over the game Nepomniachtchi versus Caruana from round 2 of the Grand Chess Tour in Croatia. It's a really interesting game, speaking to the fact that Caruana has had horrible results in this Sveshnikov line that he got on the board. It was the same line he tried to beat Carlsen with as white, and in this game he played the Sveshnikov as black and did not have such great results. But actually, it had nothing to do with the opening, even though he did seemingly get surprised by something that it looked like he didn't expect. So we have the Sveshnikov on the board. Nepomniachtchi played knight db5, d6, and here the knight to d5 sideline. Some people call it a sideline. I think it's perfectly consistent with the overall strategy here. And, the purpose is very clear. White gets 3 versus 2 on the queen side and is able to advance his pawns up and basically puts black in a critical position very early on in the game. And the general consensus in all the main lines of the Sveshnikov is that black is very, very solid in the normal lines with bishop g5. So it's not really a great mystery. If you look up the correspondence games with bishop g5 on move 7, you'll see very, very high draw rates. Whereas people just see this as kind of unexplored territory, so it's perfectly understandable. Take, and now black has this major choice should the knight be moved to e7 or to b8. b8 was the choice that Caruana preferred here. I know a lot of people like to go to e7. This is perfectly fine. Now a4 was played. One of the nice points behind a4 is that the knight can drop back to a3 and then come over to c4 if it's ever chased away by a6. So bishop e7, bishop to d2. Now this was a fresh decision. One of the core ideas here is that white is able to play a5 very early on. So after castling an a5, now black has some critical issues to deal with here. So a6 was played, chasing the knight back. The knight went back to a3, just like I mentioned. And now black played knight d7, which arguably might have been the first small mistake. Because here's the problem. Black needs to decide, how does he complete his basic development? Where should the knight on b8 and the bishop on c8 go? I think the most natural way to complete development is simply to play bishop to f5. If the bishop comes out to f5, then black can play knight to d7 and, for example, put the bishop on g6. So I thought bishop to f5, let's say bishop b4, knight to d7. I thought this would be the most natural way to play. Black can continue with moves like rook to c8 and bishop g6, try to play for f5, try to make use of the kingside majority here, so seems like a better option in the game at least. You'll see what I mean in a second. So knight d7 was played, now white played knight c4. The natural continuation that c4 square is a great outpost for the knight. Black plays f5, okay, Caruana goes for it. Bishop to b4, keeping an eye on the d6 pawn, attacking it. So black has a couple options. He can go queen c7 to defend it. He decided to opt for rook f6. Doesn't look like a bad move. Rook f6 looks extremely solid. So white now has a critical decision about what to do with the queen. Should it go to f3? Because if it goes to f3, it could potentially go to a3 or even b3. Both of those moves are interesting as a plan to attack, let's say, the d6 pawn or even the e5 pawn tactically in some lines. So queen d2 was played. I thought that was a good move. Now black has his own choice. What should he do with his rook on f6? Should he go rook g6? Should he go rook h6? I thought rook h6 looked pretty good with the idea of playing rook to b8 and then trying to sneak out with a pawn break later on. But this seems to be fine. He played rook to g6. So what should white do now? White could go queen c3 with the idea of going queen a3, putting a lot of pressure on d6 and basically asking black, how do you want to try to bring your pieces out? What's your plan going to be for even completing basic development? A pretty tough question, I would say here. So instead of queen c3, which I thought looked very good, he played g3, also a very interesting choice. And now black played e4. Not my favorite choice here. One of the things is that it does open up the e5 square and it does open up the a1 to h8 diagonal, but the bigger question here is how are these going to be made use of? How is he actually going to take advantage of that? So That's a tough question. After g3, I was thinking just play b5 right away. Seems like a perfect opportunity to just play a takes, knight takes, and if knight to a5, trying to hop into c6, here we can just play queen c7. Let's say if something like bishop e2, there's bishop d7. This looks extremely solid, and now one of black's ideas can be to improve the worst placed piece and play rook f8, for instance. So after rook f8, there may be possibilities of a pawn break on the king side. So that's what I was thinking would be most natural. E4 was played here. So plays e4, and now Nepomniachtchi opted for h4. Also looks totally reasonable. He's trying to target the rook on g6 and also restrict the bishop on e7 so that bishop to g5 is less of a concern in any variations. I thought the simple bishop to e2 would have been a good move here. Basically just asking black, what's your big strategy going to be? Because the bishop can't really leave e7 because of the d6 pawn. And if something like knight to e5, then there is knight to b6. If bishop g5, we go queen c3, and this seems to just be very good for white. So anyway, he played h4, and now b5 was played. I don't think black had any time to waste, so I think b5 had to be played. It's one of those big questions. What do you do in semi-closed positions when there just doesn't seem to be a whole lot to do? Well, in this case, he went for a direct pawn break. He opened up lines on the queen side. Made perfect sense. So a takes b6 was played, captured. Knight takes b6. And now white played knight a5. That did look really, really natural here. The other option is to go knight e3 and just play solidly there. For example, if you go knight e3, the only problem with that is that it looks like you're retreating a little bit too much. You probably have to play knight g2 and knight f4, and not everybody wants to play such a protracted, long plan. So he played knight a5. That looked really natural. Knight a5, bishop to d7, and here white queenside castle. This was really interesting. Ultimately, it didn't actually lead to anything clear. I kind of thought a really fascinating way to play would have been to just not castle, just to go bishop e2, queen c7, and then just simply go rook to a3. I thought that would have been a really interesting way to play this. And yeah, so for example, if bishop to f6, we can play h5, and here we can go bishop c3. So just trying to challenge the bishop on f6. And yeah, I mean, the opponent has an isolated a6 pawn, somewhat clumsy rook, and seems like white can at least claim a small advantage in the worst case scenario here. So anyway, Nepomniachtchi castled queenside. This was much more open-ended. So bishop f6 was played, putting the bishop on a good diagonal. Knight c6, all right. White throws the knight to a good square. Queen e8, good move, attacking the knight. King to b1, and now king to h8. This was actually a surprisingly clever move. So with the king out of play, there are no problems with any potential checks or dangerous threats or anything like that. So with the king out of the way, tactically, black's not going to fall for anything. So both of the king moves for white and then for black just avoided any tactical problems in the near future. So white decided to play h5. That seems like a neutral move, although the only problem is the h5 pawn might become weak. So it does make perfect sense to play queen to e3 and just attack the knight on b6. So for example, knight a4, attacking b2. We play bishop a3. This seems like a very interesting way to play. Notice that the rook on d1 is keeping an eye on d6 if they decide to take the pawn on c6. So going back to the game, h5 was played, rook to h6, and now white played queen e3, attacking the knight on b6, knight a4. Okay, this is where I thought the first small mistake was made. Now white c3 was played by white, and I thought that this just kind of exposes white's king unnecessarily. So I thought much simpler was just to play bishop a3, just control everything here. Sure, they can take the h5 pawn, take, we play bishop e2, queen e8, and let's say we play something positional like bishop c4. I think white has very good control of the position here, so this is a much more open-ended position. This is a bit harder to evaluate, but it looks to me like white has full compensation. So c3 was played. So by this stage, we can basically say that Caruana got the position that he wanted. I mean, the knight on a4 is well placed. The knight on c6 is attacked. The bishop on f6 is well placed. The rook on h6 is well placed. So seems like everything is in the right place for him now. And one thing he could do is he could just simply take on c6. For example, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, and if rook takes d6, go queen b7. And the point of this is that the bishop is unstable now, because now we have ideas, for example, like playing a5. And so actually, well, there are all kinds of ideas. There are knight takes b2 ideas as well, just making use of this pin. So there are all kinds of tactical problems, actually, if black had just decided to go for this. So this would have been the simple, easy way to play. He decided to take the pawn on h5. Wasn't a bad choice. I just think the other option was cleaner and a bit stronger. So rook takes h5, rook takes h5, queen takes h5, bishop e2, queen e8. Okay, so white is again playing for positional compensation. He has sacrificed a pawn, but he does have really good compensation. So bishop c4 is one possibility. He opted for king c2. That makes sense. Black played h6, okay, giving his king some luft, opening up the possibility of playing bishop to g5. So this makes good sense to me. And I kind of expected something like, again, just bishop c4 seems like a logical move. And the main point behind bishop c4 is that, well, they can't really take on c6, because if they take twice, then we have the possibility of going bishop to d5 and playing this skewer and winning back material, or winning material. So I thought that would have been sounder. I thought this was a mistake. I thought queen f4 was just a bit misguided. I see he was trying to attack d6, but I think it just backfired. a5, I think this was a great attacking resource played by Caruana. Probably deserves, I don't want to give it 2 exclamation marks, but it could. It's a very nice move, just opening up lines, demonstrating how unstable the bishop is, and opening up the possibility of taking on c6 later or playing bishop to b5. So knight takes a5 was played in the game, and, well, also, of course, bishop takes a5 couldn't have been played. We would have taken on c6 then. For example, just to illustrate, we can't play this. Simply take, and the bishop drops off, so they can't do that. So after knight takes a5, here, the simplest way to attack, I mean, notice that we're not even down material. We've just given the pawn back to create an attack. So the simplest is just bishop b5. If bishop takes, queen takes, again, he may not have noticed the threats against b2 here, because on the surface it looks like that bishop is stable there, but it's really not. So if queen takes d6, we do have knight takes b2. Notice another point of this is that the rook attacks the knight on a5. So they can't take the knight on b2, because the bishop on b4 would be pinned. So I think there were a lot of things that were missed here. So that would have been very good for black. He might have just missed it, and it was move 30, so he may have been low on time. He played knight takes c3, which was an amazing continuation. One grandmaster messaged me and said, well, it just didn't seem necessary to play that sacrifice. I can agree to a certain extent. I mean, I think the bishop b5 move just would have given him a colossal attack without any risk. So what's the material situation here? After b takes c3, he played b takes c3 in the game, and then bishop a4 check was played. I mean, probably an easier way to defend would be to take with the bishop, and then after rook takes a5 to go queen takes d6. I know not everybody would want to play that because the king looks a little bit exposed, but the main point here is that actually it's surprisingly hard to actually get at the king. So I think that white's king is actually quite safe here. So it's only kind of an optical thing that the king looks like it's weak, but probably black is slightly better here, but not clear how to attack it with these 3 pieces that don't have easy checks available. So in the game, b takes c3 was played, bishop a4 check. So this was the idea, to play bishop a4 and then win the rook on d1, king b1, take. So this was played in the game. What's the material situation now? Okay. 4 pawns for white, 5 pawns for black. Yeah, it's rook and pawn versus bishop and knight. So in this situation, now is a perfect opportunity to play rook takes a5. This would have been the perfect opportunity to justify what was played, and now after bishop takes a5, we play queen b5 check, and when they play bishop to b4, we can play bishop takes c3. I guess the one thing that you might have to worry about a little bit here is that there are possibilities, like, for example, different possibilities of creating perpetual check, and this endgame just simply being hard to win because it's opposite colored bishops. But I thought a move simply like maybe king h7, just protecting the king in advance, and then trying to attack white's exposed king. I think this would be impossible to defend. I think this should be winning for black. So basically, black's going to be up a pawn with an attack, and the f2 pawn's undefended. This should be winning. So that would illustrate that b takes c3 was a clear mistake on move 31, and bishop takes c3 was superior. So queen b5 was played. This wasn't as good. Now knight b3. All right, they're trying to keep everything secure and defended now. So this was an interesting moment. The knight on b3 is covered by the bishop on d1, so for the time being, everything is secure. But had black simply played queen takes d5, the important point is after queen takes d5, black has rook and 2 pawns versus the knight and bishop. But one of the problems is also that white's pieces feel a bit insecure, and he's just going to have a hard time defending his king in the long run. So I thought simply queen takes d5, again, would have really justified Caruana's previous play. Like, let's say bishop c2, rook c8. The c3 pawn is vulnerable now. So this, I think it's much better for black now. So thought that would have been a good way to play. So he tried bishop g5, but this ran into queen takes f5. I think what happened now is that things just got out of control. So this is move 35. Presumably time pressure was approaching, and I think things just got out of control here. That's why I think that white was eventually able to win the game. So Caruana, to his credit, he did get the position he wanted, even though initially Nepomniachtchi won the opening battle, but Caruana fought back and ended up outplaying him. But then to a certain extent, he kind of outplayed himself. Tried to play a little too brilliantly when it was not necessary. So now queen f1 was played, and white simply played queen g4, defending the bishop on d1. So queen g4, rook f8, trying to win the f2 pawn. This was good because white protected his king with king b2, rook takes f2 check, bishop c2. And now it was looking quite tough to defend. So it wasn't clear exactly how the king should be defended now. So there is actually one really nice idea I like. One really clever idea is to play bishop c1 check. And this is actually a decoy move, because what it does is it prevents the knight from coming to this d4 square, which is the ideal square for the knight to go to. So because that is kind of cut out after knight takes c1, there is queen g2. And notice that in this position, there's no knight d4 defending it. So that's actually a pretty clever way to play. For example, king h7 takes, it's probably just going to be a repetition, queen f5 check and repetition. So I think black could have snuck out with the very clever bishop c1 check decoy move of the knight on b3. But he played queen c4, and then he ran into queen e6. It's hard to know what he missed here. Bishop f6, queen takes d6. So at this moment, white has the 2 minor pieces against the rook, 3 pawns for both sides, but it's looking much better for white. So I thought the only chance was, again, to just make use of the pin along the second rank and play queen e2. And we can't go knight d4 now, of course, because of the bishop, but we can't go knight to a1. So I think knight to a1 would have been one of those Steinitzian types of moves, which is very solid and keeps everything secure. For example, queen c4, queen b6. It's not quite clear. So first of all, it's not quite clear how white is going to unravel here, but at the same time, it does look pretty good. Now with the queen out of the way, there is the possibility of playing d6. So with the d6 possibility, white should be much better here. So I'm afraid Caruana gave the game away with rook takes c2 check. He just could not justify this sacrifice. King takes c2. Now queen d3 check was played. I thought if queen e2 check, we get out of the checks here pretty comfortably. King b1, check. King a2, they run out of checks. If queen to c2 check, we simply walk up king a3. and the knight does a wonderful job preventing all the checks. So what happened instead is he tried queen to d3 check, king b2, and he tried to push the pawn, but it didn't work. Queen e6, e2, king a3. Excellent move. So the king is completely out of harm's way now. So with the king just not in any danger now, this is a pretty clear win for white. So if, for example, queen c4, we can just play knight to d4. And the d-pawn is going to be very strong for me. Notice that I'm not even worried about them taking, because now my bishop on b4 is doing a good job controlling the e1 square. So I don't have any issues. With that. So after bishop to g5, white just played d6, check, king b2. Notice how safe white's king is, how hard it is to actually check. Queen d3, d7. White makes use of his passed pawn. King h7, and now is the perfect moment for c4. As you can see, after c4 was played, the bishop on b4 covers everything. e1's covered, there's nothing to threaten. Bishop f6 check, king a3, and here we see white's pieces perfectly coordinating together. Notice how the c and d pawns can both be very strong. The queen's in a great position. The knight on b3 guards everything. The bishop on b4 is guarding e1, so there's not much to do here. Queen c2, and now Nepomniachtchi played queen takes f6, and Caruana had to admit defeat because the pawn's going to queen. d8 queen is going to come up next, and there is no response. So unfortunately, Caruana's experiment in the Sveshnikov did not go as planned. He did manage to outplay his opponent, but in the complications, things turned sour.